Hello everyone, I'm going to be taking a little break from making capital videos this week in order to talk about the Utopian Socialist. It's not that I don't like making capital videos, I think it's the greatest work ever written, but I want to get into other topics, still about socialism of course. So who are the Utopian Socialists, and what is Utopian Socialism? And is it different than the socialism advanced by Marx? Well, as you may or may not know, Karl Marx did not invent socialism. The concept of abolishing class differences was nothing new, even back in Marx's time. However, something happened around the 1790s in Europe that made socialist discourse and ideas spring up from all sorts of places. I'm talking, of course, about the French Revolution. Now, it's impossible for me to give an accurate explanation of what happened during the French Revolution and its impact. One, because I don't fully understand it myself yet, and two, even if I did, it would take me an entire series of videos to do so. Luckily, this series has already been made in the form of a podcast by Mike Duncan. He has a podcast called Revolutions, and he goes super in-depth into the French Revolution. It's super good and I highly recommend it. But for the sake of this video, I will give the quick and dirty Marxist perspective of the French Revolution. Around the turn of the 18th century, French society, and pretty much all of Europe, was divided into three sectors called the Three Estates. The first estate was the clergy, the second estate was the nobility, and the third estate was pretty much everyone else, like 95% of the population, the commoners. Now, for some centuries, the most privileged portion of the third estate, that we call the capitalist bourgeoisie, the bankers, merchants, lawyers, doctors, manufacturers, industrialists, started to amass most of the country's wealth and industry, while simultaneously being denied any political power. France was still operating under its feudal system of ancient privileges, where your advancement in society was based on your lineage. The nobles were basically in charge, not because of their merits or anything, but because they were just born nobles. This led to conflict and then triumph of the Third Estate over the clergy and nobility, and the monarchy itself. A republic was declared, the monarchy was abolished, ancient privileges were destroyed, everyone was now equal before the law. But even more so, the French Revolution put every aspect of society that came before into question. All the superstition and fear and oppression of the Middle Ages, should it be included in our new modern society that is based on justice and reason? Catholicism, is it good or bad? Should we keep it? Yes, the people do love their Jesus, but the clergy's power should be eliminated and their property should be expropriated. What about the king? We don't need that traitor, cut off his head. What about time itself? Have we been doing it wrong? Yes, we should create a new calendar based on the number 10. 20 hours in a day, 10-day weeks, and every month should be renamed to something badass based on nature, like Vendémiaire, grape harvest, or Brumaire, month of fogs, or Fructidor, fruits. That last thing did not last very long, as you can probably tell, but you get the point, a lot of things were changing. To everyone, it seemed like the dawning of a new age, and in many aspects it really was. However, as much as things changed, other things just seemed to stay the same. The quote-unquote people seem to be as poor and destitute as always. So what if the people in charge are now the bourgeoisie instead of the nobility? The conditions of the workers were still the same. Terrible. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. The Industrial Revolution that started in England and gradually spreading throughout all of Europe is transforming society in drastic ways. The scientific application of machinery to dramatically increase the productive power of society looks great on paper. Sure, you are producing like 10 times more than just 20 years ago with even less manpower. But why is there still a swarm of people in rags begging on the streets when there is such an abundance of things? Why do we see women and children selling themselves for 16 hours a day, doing back-breaking work for a miserable wage that just barely allows them to purchase their daily means of life? This isn't a reasonable society based on eternal justice, it's just as bad, and in many aspects it's even worse than before. The French Revolution promised us an end to all this misery and oppression. What went wrong? In this sort of environment is when you have a string of socialist thinkers spring up eager to give their 2 cents on what is wrong with society and how to fix it. For them, the work of the French Revolution was still not over. Yes, the revolution managed to eliminate class privileges, but what they should have done, and failed to do, was eliminate classes themselves. We call these the Utopian Socialist, and I will explain why at the end of this video. The 3 most important ones, and the ones we will be studying in this video, are Henri de Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier, and Robert Owen. Note that these people were active when Marx was not even born yet, or just barely in diapers. We will start with Henri de Saint-Simon. Saint-Simon was a son of the French Revolution that erupted when he was just 30 years old. We said before that the French Revolution was the triumph of the Third Estate, the active working majority portion of the population, over the privileged idle classes of the clergy and nobility. But not only that, it was really the triumph of a small portion of the Third Estate, the propertied bourgeoisie, the merchants, businessmen, bankers that conquered political power. Hence, Saint-Simon's version of the class struggle was the workers versus the idlers. In his view, the workers were the productive people of society. This includes, of course, the wage laborers and the peasant farmers, but strangely enough, also the bourgeoisie, as in the business owners that paid those wages. The idlers were the class of people that did not work at all, like the ancient nobility and the landlords that just lived off the rents. Note that this is much different than the Marxist class struggle that emphasizes the proletariat, as in the propertyless wage laborers, versus the bourgeoisie. It might seem a little strange that this is so. We might be inclined to write off Saint-Simon, to say, he just got it wrong, what an idiot. But we must consider the context from which he came. This way of framing the class struggle corresponded just fine in a time where big industry was really not that developed in France yet. And so the antagonism between the wage laborers and the owners was not so pronounced. In 1816, Saint-Simon declared that politics is the science of production, and predicted the total absorption of politics into economy. This, of course, lays the foundation for the very important Marxist idea of the abolition of the state. That is, in a classless society, the state turns from a monster of oppression, with its prisons and police, and protector of the capitalist regime, into a simple administration of things, and director of the processes of production, headed by the proletariat. His idea of a socialist society was a planned economy under the direction of a central bank and the industrialist, where everyone is a productive member of society. There is no leisure class. Every man must work. However, he didn't really get a chance to implement it. Our next guy is Charles Fourier. Fourier was a sharp, witty critique of the existing social conditions. He sarcastically takes the prophets of the French Revolution at their word when they promised a society in which reason alone would reign, of a civilization in which happiness should be universal. Yes, this bourgeois society is such a paradise, where 6-year-old children have to destroy their developing bodies, working 20 hours a day for a bowl of lentils. It is so much better than before. Fourier's critique of the bourgeois relations between the sexes is also worth mentioning. It is thought that the word feminist originated from him. He was the first to declare that in any given society, the degree of a woman's emancipation is the natural measure of the general emancipation. Basically, you want to see how free and happy a society is, look at the position of the women. Fourier divides the history of society into 4 stages of evolution: savagery, barbarism, patriarchat, and civilization. Civilization being the current bourgeois society of today. Further, he argued that civilization moves in a vicious cycle, saying that no, society isn't always improving, always getting closer to perfection through each historical phase. Each phase has its own periods of descent and ascent. Each one has its own set of problems that it must deal with that phases before never experienced. His version of socialism was a system of small communities called phalansteres, in which everything belonged to everyone, with communal homes and consumer cooperatives. In order to prevent the rise of wealth in any sector, the richer would get a smaller part of the share, while the poorer got more in order to balance things out. He actually managed to found a couple of these. Now on to the next and last guy, Robert Owen. Owen was a man of almost sublime, childlike simplicity of character, and at the same time one of the few born leaders of men. While the great industry was beginning to flourish in Britain, men everywhere saw this as an opportunity to take advantage of the chaos and make some quick riches exploiting poor people for their labor. But Owen saw this as an opportunity to bring some order into this chaos. He was able to start directing his own cotton weaving factory in New Lanark, Scotland, but he operated a bit differently than the other factories. He actually gave his workers conditions worthy of human beings. For example, while the vast majority of factories had 14 to 15-hour shifts, Owen made them work 10 hours and a half. He also funded preschools where the workers' children would be sent to at the age of 2, and these were so loved by the children that it was difficult to get them to go home. When an industrial crisis forced Owen's factory to shut down for 4 months, the workers at New Lanark were left jobless, but Owen still continued to pay their wages in full, which is better than the unemployment benefits we have now in many parts of the US. Despite all this, Owen's factory had doubled its value and made Owen a very rich man. He was a celebrity of sorts. At one point he was one of the most famous men in Europe, beloved by the poor and rich alike. The virgin Karl Marx versus the Chad Robert Owen. Having achieved everything in life, you would think that Robert Owen would stop there. However, he was still not satisfied. These people, my workers, that I have given a relatively good life, are still far from being capable of developing themselves fully as free human beings. They are still, at the end of the day, my slaves. No, we must go further. They are the ones who made my immense wealth. It is to them that the fruits of their labor must belong. With the practicality of a true businessman, Owen started to cook up his own plans for a socialist community, all with precise estimates of the cost and projected outputs. I propose a series of communist colonies that would hold the factory in common ownership of the workers. Instead of the profit going to the owners or the shareholders, it all goes back to the people. You know, Robert, that sounds pretty cool, but I have to ask, how much money are we going to make from this, if we fund this project? Well, that's the thing, you're not going to make any profit. That's not the point. These are self-sufficient communities. All the earnings are returned to the workers. Yeah, I don't think we're going to go with that. Not surprisingly, this turn to communism did not go well for him. Overnight, he went from being the most popular man in Europe to public enemy number one. He was completely shunned by the media. But Owen didn't care. Using his immense wealth, he managed to found several communist communities in the Americas that were ultimately unsuccessful. Having lost all his wealth, he returned to England where he continued to be a strong defender of the working class. So this concludes our study of the Utopian Socialist, but I still need to explain why they're known as the Utopian Socialist. I thought it made more sense to explain at the end of this video, so here it goes. We saw from our study that Saint-Simon, Fouquier, and Owen had their own differing versions of socialism. They saw that the present society kind of sucks. How about we try this instead? To them, socialism is their own expression of the absolute truth. It is what they thought would lead to a perfect, ideal society, hence the word utopian. But humans are inherently flawed creatures, so of course all these attempts to create a perfect society were doomed to fail. This is not what socialism is to Karl Marx. To the Marxist, socialism is simply the natural progression of history based on material conditions. The socialism advanced by Marx is scientific. It's rooted in reality. Now, I do plan to explain this in detail, the science behind Marxism, but I won't be able to in this one. It needs an entire video of its own to explain, most likely the next one. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. If you liked this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Goodbye.